Hello everybody, welcome to Roxborough Roundtables number 5. Today we'll be discussing the Ebola crisis, the science, and the hype behind it. With us today we have
Matt Baker, Executive Dean of the College of Science, Health, and Liberal Arts.
Chris Pastor, Professor of Transdisciplinary Studies.
Lauren Jabe, third year Law and Society student.
Jeff Siepel, Vice President for Information Resources.
Anika Thomas, fourth year Communications major.
Okay, what I'd like to start it off with, we begin, because we want to talk about hype, but I think it'd be a good place to start is science. Matt, can you give us a little background on what Ebola is and your experience as a physician's assistant with it?
Never treated a case as a physician assistant. We had to study it in a period of time that I worked in the military. And basically, it is a virus. It's in a larger group of viruses that's classified as a filovirus, though the actual classification is Ebola virus. And it's classified as a hemorrhagic virus, which means it can cause bleeding complications as it's in sort of its last stages of the disease itself. And it is first cases were discovered in Sudan and simultaneously Zaire in 1976, and it was at that time in very small villages and had not spread because patients with this disease tend to, at least in the past, have died very quickly. And so when they manifested the disease, it has a incubation period of a couple of days to like 3 weeks, which is why when they quarantine somebody to make sure they don't have it, contacts.
And for those who don't understand, incubation means you're not showing symptoms, but you still have the disease.
Exactly. You're carrying the disease, but you're not showing symptoms.
Okay.
But after you show symptoms, people had died within about 2 weeks, about 16 days. From complications, and so it had not spread out of small villages until the 2014 outbreak, which is in large
Just
cities.
to clarify that, Matt, I want to make sure. You're only contagious after incubation?
Well, many diseases are contagious during incubation when you don't know you have it, and after incubation. This one, most cases have been, first of all, it's not contacted by air droplets. So you're coughing, you're sneezing, things you would see with the flu, things that you would see with a cold, things you would see with smallpox. You don't see with this disease. This is a blood and body fluid related disease, blood-borne and body fluid related disease.
Is it similar to AIDS?
In the way that it is transmitted, it's similar, but it has a lot of differences in the manifestation and in how it is, the incubation period. Similar to hepatitis B and HIV in the way that it is spread through body fluids. And
So I want to be very clear, especially with the students here, Anika. Did you know how it was spread before we just said this year?
I just recently found out, I think last week, that it was bodily fluids. I think the misconception is that it's airborne and that it's something that you can contract by just breathing on someone. But yeah, I didn't really know all the ins and outs of it until right now.
Same thing, Lauren?
Well, I'm the daughter of a healthcare professional, so that was one of the things that I knew before. So when everyone was freaking out, I was like, it's really no big deal unless you touch anything that they've produced.
But going from what the press, and we want to talk about that a little bit, from what the press is producing, and we have with us Natalie Nixon, who's probably coming in and going, this is not Rob Fleming, because today we have an emergency roundtable. We're talking about Ebola today. So why don't you introduce yourself first, who you are, and then I'll ask you the question.
Hi, I'm Natalie Nixon, professor here at Philadelphia University, director of the Strategic Design and BA program.
What has been your impression of how the press has been handling the Ebola, as they put it, crisis?
I think it's interesting how the perception has shifted as a disease far away over there, somewhere in Africa, to now it definitely, because of the recent case of the Liberian man who ended up dying in the hospital in Texas, and some other related Americans who have disease. I think it's becoming, the way the press is now treating it, there's a heightened urgency, because now there are obviously Americans who are directly affected by the disease. So I mean, I think that in itself is really interesting, how unfortunately we don't treat disease with the same amount of urgency that obviously, since it could be contracted through bodily fluids, it can happen to anybody, no matter where in the world you're living, because of the way diseases can transmit. It's unfortunate that now it just has this heightened sense of urgency, because it's geographically just coming a bit closer to home.
I just want to throw some statistics, okay? The annual number of severe cases of flu in the year is 3 to 5 million. The annual number of deaths of flu, and that's just a normal when it isn't a severe outbreak, is 250,000 to 500,000 people. We have one dead person in Dallas. I turn on the news, I hear nothing about the flu, which seems to be a real danger, but yet I hear screaming on all stations, not only just Fox, which we'll get to, but on all stations, of this unbelievable horror that's coming our way. And what I don't understand, I was hoping perhaps around this table, is more people died as a result of drunk driving as I've been speaking. Millions die of cancer every year, especially breast cancer and so forth, lung cancer, heart disease, hepatitis, all these diseases. No one's screaming about any of this. One person dies in Dallas, and suddenly it's the end of the world, according to the press.
I think it's the unknown. I think that we saw this with SARS. And I think everyone knows somebody that has had the flu. And everybody knows that there's a flu vaccine. So the flu kills a lot of people. And mostly it kills immunocompromised babies and the elderly. But it kills a lot of people, you're right. But there's some fear of the unknown, and there's also fear of, so we saw this with SARS when we saw the first cases in Asia, and comes over here. And people, the impression is that if you get this, you will die, right? It's just like the first time we saw HIV in the United States in the 80s, in the early 80s. It was considered to be universally fatal. We know from this outbreak, at least 2014 Ebola, that that's not the case. We know, number one, that about 50% of the people that have been identified, so for about 8,000 people identified, maybe 4,000 people dead, 3,900. So it's about 50% mortality. And that has, that's different than 100%, and where you are is very different, and depending on the healthcare situation is very different. So sometimes and it is growing, so I think this is really pretty serious. Whether or not it hype is, because I think it's just like when SARS came out, or the first time that they talked about HIV, where it seems really fatal, people don't understand it, they don't know about it, it's I think we saw that with anthrax, with a lot of scares. In fact, anthrax is also not contagious from person to person. And people were really afraid, but things that we know kill people, like MRSA, people are less afraid of.
I think it's got all the elements of a horror story, right? It's unknown, it's sudden, right? Dying in days or 2 weeks. It just has a lot of morbid entertainment value. Because obviously the numbers don't work, right? You mentioned flu. Let's go to malaria, right? That makes flu look like it's meaningless.
Yeah.
But Ebola is scary, and because it's scary, it draws our attention, and we want to hear about it as a people. It doesn't matter how relevant it is. It's the fear of the unknown and the rapidity, and even 50% is a pretty high mortality rate for the disease.
I think kind of going off of what you said, it's also that flu and drunk driving, and heart disease, that's all old news. We've been taught this our whole lives. I'm not scared of the flu anymore, like you said. I personally am not scared of Ebola, but the general public, we want that thrill, we want that what's gonna happen.
I think within the media, there's also this there's a way that we sensationalize new things. So like I think the media kind of plays a big role in making us really keeps it on our minds all the time, and it's the same thing that they're broadcasting, but it's the same thing over and over. So it's always in your mind. So you think it's something that's really big and really we have to worry about it. And also I think it's the way the government kind of isn't really saying anything about it, or the way they try to hide that we have the cure but we don't really have the cure. There's just this mysticism that kind of draws us into it, so we don't really know how to cure it. So I think that's why it's always present on our minds.
I think you bring up a really good point, and I just want to throw it out there. There's this distrust out there of medicine and in the government. For example, you have these anti-vaxxers out there that are saying that vaccines are destroying young children, giving them autism or whatever it may be, and the truth is being hidden by the government and big pharma or whatever it may be. So we have this feeling that there's some sort of insidious, almost conspiracy out there of silence on medicine, and we don't trust. If the government says, don't worry about it, we get a guy on from the CDC says, it's okay, where this woman Hasselbeck, I believe her training is that her husband was a football player. I think that gives her experience to be on television. And she said to this guy who is either head of the CDC or is a very big, important,
It's the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases of the National Institute of Health. His name is Dr. Anthony Fauci.
Right, he would know some things, but Michelle Hasselbeck, whatever, with her qualifications, she says, you're being too calm because you're hiding things from us. So is this distrust of the medicine field that is out there?
It's just trying to create some sort of scandal, create sensationalism. It's nothing to do with facts.
I think there's also, I'm just going to put this out there may be something to kind of the politics of disease and the politics of disease's origination. And I really think there's still very much alive a bit of Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness perception of Africa. You mentioned HIV/AIDS, which was thought to first originate in Africa from monkeys, and I don't know what the facts are with that, but I think there's some there still remains a perception of Africa, the dark continent, a lot of unknowns there, a disease that is perceived to have originated out of that continent there's a whole nother loaded dimension in our perception of how dangerous it is, and that there's history to this. This is not a new type of reaction to a fatal disease that comes out of Africa.
Does race have anything to do with it?
I think that some of the reports that I heard about from the Liberian community, because I think that the man who, when he first, there was some accusations that he wasn't treated immediately, that he didn't receive the same amount of care that other Americans
in the Dallas hospital.
In the Dallas hospital, and there was, in between the lines, there was the message I got was because he was black, he was an African man, and he wasn't treated the same way as other Americans in that hospital who weren't black were treated.
Could it be also, and I didn't even see that part, and you're absolutely right, because I've heard about that, but I was thinking maybe the fear is just, it's out of Africa, that that makes it more dangerous, as you put it, makes it more uncivilized somehow.
Well, we have a whole legacy narrative about Africa that we can't ignore. There is a narrative about the continent of Africa that's in our literature, it's in our popular culture, that you can't act like doesn't exist. It's part of the context that from which people are acting, whether they admit it or not, whether they're conscientious about it or not. It is there.
Why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure, my name is Adrian Johnston. I teach writing for design here. I was coming for the other conversation, but I'm happy to talk about this.
As President Spinelli puts it, we're very nimble at this university. What is your take? You've been listening.
Well, it seems to me that I think there is this narrative that there's sort of this out of Africa thing, and then there's two other things that I would pick up on that other people have mentioned. And part of it is the foreignness of the disease. You know, I mean, I think the same thing with the SARS is a good example. You know, like that also has this sort of foreign danger feel to it that feeds into that type of horror story, like you were saying. And then the other thing that strikes me, that all of these things, all of these elements have to do with the media. You know, where's the media responsibility in all of this? Because it really is the media that's picking out these elements as they see fit to then sensationalize, and that there's a lot of responsibility there that maybe isn't being owned up to in the way that.
I think going along the lines of what you were saying, they spent, I think it was CNN, hours and hours and hours trying to, story after story, try to track down that one guy who might have had contact with that gentleman who came back from Liberia. Is that really the way the media should be using their time and building this fear? Jeff?
Well, you know, one variable that over the past 2 decades that has become a part of almost every moment of our lives is the network, the web, the internet. So 20 years ago, this would have been a very different type of story. Maybe it wouldn't have been a story, I don't know. But it seems to me what CNN does, and other networks do the same thing, is they're trying to elevate themselves above every one of us in this room who can be a publisher, creator, blogger, writer, with any basis you care to claim. So now the world is full of producers. Well, how do I separate CNN from that? Well, they kind of go off on a rail and spend hours looking for that man, or weeks looking for a plane in the Indian Ocean, so that they're in essence, they're trying to rise above many other voices who may have more facts, better story, more accuracy, and of course they have to sell airtime, they have to sell, there's an advertising component, there's commerce wrapped up in what they do. There may not be in a large majority of bloggers out there. There may be, but there may not be. So all of a sudden the world is full of experts at all levels, producers of stories, of video. You know, I look at YouTube and say there's kind of there's a multitude of groups. There's really low-end stuff that's done on high-quality equipment. Then there's some fabulous stories that are done on, horrible stories done on high-def equipment, and then there's these great stories that are done on low-end equipment. So you judge content versus quality, and across this stuff, everyone can be an expert. Who subscribes to which expert is what.
And what constitutes the media?
Yeah,
It becomes a big question.
Of course.
I think I agree with you that there is fear, and then the people and the press do chase after shiny objects. They
Oh, no question.
just love to do this,
Right.
but in some things have been sort of useful. I mean, so maybe the woman who was on The View, maybe not be an authority, but Rand Paul made a very interesting comment, and the man's a physician. I mean, people see he's a politician, but he was trained as an ophthalmologist in medical school. His dad's a physician, so he would know. And he said, well, he made a comment about how it's spread that may not be totally proven by the evidence. Could be proven in 5 years, I don't know. But right now it's not proven, but maybe it is spread airborne. And the media has done something in trying to at least put a number of people on who said, no, we found no evidence of this, and there is it's not an approved treatment, but this monoclonal antibody, the ZMabb, that might work. Because if you remember the first time this virus hit the United States, we figured out it was there. It was in the late 80s. There was lab animals that were transported into Reston, Virginia. You heard this story?
No, go ahead.
If you haven't heard the story, it's a great story, and I'll give you the book to read. It was a New York Times bestseller. But these animals came in because we use animals to test medications. And they were in a lab in Reston, Virginia, in the middle of a mall, across the street from an elementary school. And the animals were infected. And then, I will tell you, you may not have heard about it, but the federal government was terrified. Because at that point, they thought, you could see the CDC saying, well, we think we might have a treatment, might work, we might have a vaccine in 5 years, so there's less fear, but they were really afraid. If you want to read the book's by a great author by the name of Preston. The book is called The Hot Zone. Many movies were created on it, but not exactly. It was about how the federal government, the CDC, the USAMRIID part of the Army, went and had to euthanize these monkeys. They had to kill the animals and burn them but they were so afraid in the 80s. This was all over the government. And now there's less, and you can see some people out there saying, I think if we use public health measures, we might be able, it's real serious, public health measures, we might be able to contain it. And 2, we have a monoclonal antibody that's very hard to produce. There wasn't enough for the person in Texas. There's no more left, apparently. But they're trying to produce it, the drug company, one company produces it. And then these monoclonal antibody drugs you can use them now for rheumatoid arthritis. You see them on television all the time. You can use them for psoriasis, very expensive, $10,000. So it's, and then there's a vaccine we're working on. So I think some of the government people are less afraid. And I hear them I hear the other people on television too, but at least I'm hearing those voices on television saying, this may be something we can deal with.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting that it's all none of it's to be believed, but the signal-noise ratio is very, very difficult to overcome because in many cases the noise is overwhelming.
What that lets you do as a consumer of media is now you have many choices, so you choose which media you consume. And,
Right.
and of course, the bigger media companies respond to that. So if people want to watch CNN run around for 8 hours hunting someone down, they will continue to do it because people keep watching it. If people say, I don't want to watch that, they'll stop reporting that way and we'll start reporting the way people want to hear reports.
I want to go back to something Natalie said, the politics of it. I found it interesting that the anti-immigration people seem to be the loudest voices on the Ebola virus. You want
Not
to
only
comment?
that, I read a little article about how the politicians, especially the GOP, are using it to kind of bring down Obama in some way. Senator Rand was mentioned, and also Louis Gohmert from Texas. He said the military is not trained to go and catch Ebola and die. He went on to say the president's priorities are all mixed up because he's saying that it's wrong that we're sending our people in to go and help the infected. And I think it's kind of wrong that they're using this for their own personal
Political tool.
reasons.
2 of those
Yeah.
people are running for president.
This also ties into Jeff's comment, though, that with so many voices that can be heard, I'm sure you could find someone blaming Ebola on anything you want to blame it on. Right? Someone will blame George Bush for Ebola. Someone will blame
It's your fault.
the winter, the temperature. Right? So there's so much noise, you can easily find somebody saying something ridiculous.
But
Right?
Go ahead.
it becomes an interesting example of how disease becomes a platform for rhetoric. And this is a really interesting case of rhetoric and using different media and distribution channels of information to persuade for a political end, for a perception end, for public policy end. But it's a really loud and vibrant example of the power of rhetoric and how the tools for rhetoric have really shifted because of all of the social media platforms.
So what I'm fascinated by is bringing the same coalition together. It goes back to fear of the foreigner, which goes back to fear of the immigrant, all that. This is a foreign disease. It's from Africa. It's that fear of the foreigner invading America, coming here, and I find absolutely amazing that the anti-immigration people who are actually saying, this is not my thing, that Ebola is coming on the back of the immigrants coming from Mexico. I said, wow, talk about bringing all these narratives of racism and anti-immigration and the disease all together. It's beautiful.
Well, that's so wacko that you heard somewhere. That's not a common philosophy. You can find it. Someone I'm sure has said the aliens have brought Ebola here. But it's not a real debate.
But Chris, when this is a CDC site, but when you can use and Natalie's a design faculty, she'll understand this, I'm sure. When you can dress the page up to look extraordinarily professional and expert, the content is treated as expert.
But as you said, there are hundreds of millions of voices, many of them look expert. Now, as a consumer of media, I have to engage my own critical thinking to make some determination about what I'm reading.
I don't think that's the middle sector of the normal distribution of population. I think they roll with the tide that has influenced them before.
Think so?
I think so. I mean, how many of them didn't know who Joe Biden was the other night on, who was it? I mean, it's frightening.
It's,
I don't know the reference.
Sorry.
the famous saying that somebody really brilliant that I can't remember who it was said that, you know, like Washington D.C. is it's a million people with a solution waiting for a problem. So whether that problem is a disease or it's planes hitting towers or it's fracking or it's anything that's an issue, people have an agenda, and maybe it's like the anti-immigrant.
And they'll tie it to whatever
And
single
they'll say,
player is up.
oh no, here's a problem that I have my one solution, and
Right,
now I can link it to that problem, but you
And
can
they'll link it to every problem.
see that with everything. But I think disease becomes very politicized very quickly. You could see that with tuberculosis. You could see it with I mean, just the Great Plagues of Europe and everything. I mean, it's a fascinating thing to watch how political diseases are.
I mean, in some ways, you could look at world history through the lens of disease, and disease being the prompter and catalyst for huge migrations, for shifts in public policy, for shifts in agriculture, for so much stuff. And I just wanted to tie into all the great points people make about rhetoric is if we were just to pull up the Twitter feed on hashtag Ebola, right through there you would see the diversity of agendas that people are tacking on to Ebola. Just if you were to pull that up.
Dylan, you just arrived. Why don't you give us your thoughts?
Uh,
Dylan's a law society student.
Thank you, Professor Lane.
I always get that in there.
Yeah, thank you. Just from the brief time that I was sitting in, it doesn't really seem like the outbreak of Ebola is an issue. It seems like the media is making it more of an issue than it is. From what just a brief information I've gathered just on the internet, the CNN articles go on and on and on about all sorts of evils, but then you go to the CDC website and it's just facts, and what it looks like is only one person has died, and we've got a completely in the United States. In the United States, one person in the United States has died, but other than that, we have it completely under control, and it just seems like they're making it a big deal.
There's an interesting thing across my mind, if for those of you who remember back to the years before 9/11, there was, every once in a while there'd be a thread of commentary about terrorism throughout the rest of the world, and how we always sort of had this view of it at a distance. And the moment it came to our shores, our lives changed forever. I feel like this is an example.
Mm-hmm.
If this is a very serious disease,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't spread, and it's not impacting at the same level as TB or a number of others. But all of a sudden, it crossed airspace and into this country, and it has just gone from here to there on the news coverage. But the reality might be a little different.
Yeah, I mean, the public health people always have to try to stay calm.
Yeah.
But if you listen to Fauci and you listen to Frieden, they are worried. And the reason they're worried is because in 76, like I said, it was in very small remote villages. And now it's in cities big cities with airports, and they're international cities. And so people can travel, and they're always concerned. It was just like when SARS was or bird flu, it was a few farmers in rural Vietnam or something like that couldn't spread beyond that. But once you get into large cities, which is where it is now, that's why you see the other outbreaks were 300-400 cases. This outbreak, 8,000 cases.
I heard that the models are not predicting the spread correctly. That the CDC models are under-predicting the spread, and that's had some epidemiologists concerned. Is that accurate?
Probably the models are both WHO models and CDC models.
Okay.
And they base it on, I mean, we base a lot of things on, and I'm not an expert on epidemiology models, but they base it on both past behavior, how it's spread,
Okay,
and concentric rings, they call them.
okay.
But why I think CDC right now is nervous is that they, it's in international cities where people travel. And once that happens, then there's no way to, I know now they're sending CDC personnel to 5 airports as of today, but to do screening, but there's no way.
And we've just said the movie World War Z, right? So back to the horror story thing.
And we're all being vampires.
This is a reminder of it, right?
What you're bringing up is because I'm reacting in a way. I want to know if anyone else is reacting because we keep on getting bombarded constantly by the next disaster. SARS was going to be this. Even HIV, which was horrible, was projected to be even worse, as bad as that can be. The hurricanes are going to come, and this hurricane is worse than that hurricane. And sometimes they are, like Sandy. But many times, they're not. And we almost get the boy who cried wolf syndrome, where the people go, all right, you know, we heard that about SARS, we heard it about that disease, the pig flu, whatever it may be, the chicken flu, whatever it may be. And every time it seems to be another disaster rolling our way through the media machine, sometimes through governments, sometimes definitely through the internet. And we get to the point like we're sitting here and going, you know what, I know we have a physician's assistant who knows a lot sitting here, but he's being too nervous because we've heard this before. And maybe that's why we may not take it as seriously. Just ask Anika, am I out of my mind here, or does it make some sense to you?
I think you're right. But I also think when we think about HIV and AIDS and all the things that we've kind of become accustomed to as a culture, once, if ever, Ebola becomes like a livable virus, it'll turn into the way we talk about AIDS, where you don't really understand how it works until you're going through it, or until your family member is going through it. So I feel like Ebola, even now, if you were saying, if you look on Twitter, the way that people talk about it, it's kind of already become like a joke in a way. Even, did you want to say something?
Oh, no.
Yeah, it's become a joke in a way with a lot of young people anyway, because we don't really know so much about it, and we don't really take the time to look into the information about it. So, yeah.
I was gonna say about the guy on the airline Wednesday,
Yeah.
who sneezed and said, "Oh, I have Ebola," and then CDC
Yeah.
came in with their things. Like, that's just, I mean, I think, like you said, our generation, the things that we don't know, we joke about, and that's how we get through it. And I think if they keep bombarding us, not only it's gonna start becoming, old news. It's like, I don't care about this. Like, I'm just gonna make a joke about it, and
I think it's the risk that well, not the risk, but it's part of the package now. With so much access to information, part of what one of the consequences is that we have to deal with determining, is it crying wolf, or is it something that we should take seriously? And it's one of the maybe unintended consequences of having access to so much information. And maybe another unintended consequence is that eventually people will just become deadened to new news. And you joke about it at a much more shorter amount of time than would have happened in the 1980s, for example.
Dylan?
Like you were saying, we already know so much about it just from all the information we have at our fingertips. We're already numb to it, and it's kind of it is a danger. Ebola is dangerous, and we're already making jokes about it on Twitter. It's that freaks me out. That makes me very unnerved. But at the same time, is it really something we need to be concerned about? It seems like we have it under control, at least in the States. Africa's obviously got some issues, but as far as we're concerned, and I hate to say that, But as far as we're concerned, do we have an issue with Ebola? I don't see that. I don't think we do.
I think if we, because as you mentioned, it's only through bodily fluids and like one of the big things in Africa that causes the spread is that washing the dead bodies. Like as long as we don't don't go and mop up someone's blood without protective gear. Don't go and scrub a toilet of some like random person without proper precautions. I mean, I kind of think of that as common sense, even if I know the person and someone's bleeding. Like, oh yeah, I'll help you. I'll throw you some gauze and stuff, but I'm not gonna sit there and wrap your wound just because that's how I was raised to protect myself. So I feel like if we keep those kind of precautions, it's not really that big of a deal.
But what we already have happened in this country, and it happened in Madrid as well, is what we thought were standard protocols weren't followed. All right? The nurse in Madrid now believes that she touched her face with a glove when she was degloving, so that the virus was, or some fluid was on the glove, and that is what has caused her to become sick. In the case of the gentleman that died in Dallas, well, Matt, why don't you speak to the protocols in Dallas and maybe what did or didn't take place?
I think there was a problem. So the cases that had come before, they were identified as having the disease before they came here. They get shipped to Atlanta right near the CDC, and everybody's prepared.
Practically in a container.
They're not. This poor gentleman sat in the emergency department and had to be based on whether or not we can actually figure stuff out in the emergency department, whether or not we understand. I mean, somebody who says this, I have the worst headache of my life, you go in the CAT scan, you say I have chest pain, you're way back, and a cardiologist is there in about 8 seconds. But people sitting around coughing, how many? I don't know. You probably all sat in the emergency room. I've sat in there for hours in the waiting room, and people.
It's the best place to get sick.
I'm always looking across the saying, does that person have tuberculosis? Does this person have something that's going to make me really sick? So, and red flags did not go up, even though he said to them specifically, here's my concerns. So I think they probably could have, and I think the Madrid case is why it's one of the things that make the CDC nervous. I hate to make people nervous and don't want to seem like an alarmist, but even though this isn't highly contagious, which means I can't cough and give it to you, it's fluids. It is a really infectious, so even a few small particles of blood or feces, or even it's in semen, it's in breast milk, but any body fluid, but even small portions have infected people, and that's and so in ways I don't want to believe that. I think what the administration did now in sending a large contingent of people over to certain areas to build these treatment units, these treatment centers, and to try to create protocols, I think was a great thing. I think it's a good use of our.
And that's an excellent segue for the last thing I want to discuss. We're all talking about protecting ourselves.
I think they
And
did.
I'll ask you everything, how do we stay safe here? And then the Obama administration has gotten criticism for sending people over because they may get the disease and bring it back. So what is our responsibility as Americans, as good citizens of the world? Do we close our borders and say, hey, it's not here, and try to keep people out? Or do we send our citizens over, our trained citizens, to treat people in different countries who don't have the level of health care that we have?
Anyone who's in public health would say that there is no such thing as an infectious disease that's somebody else's problem. I mean, this is not a problem in Sierra Leone. Every infectious disease now, because of aircraft, can be anywhere at any time, so we need to treat it as a world. If you want to treat other things, you can segment them if you'd like, but infectious disease nobody in infectious disease public health believes that any disease is limited to the country where the first case was seen.
And I'm sure you've heard people say, our doctors will go there, get the disease, come back, and spread it in the United States. And how do you answer that?
One, right now, we're not going to staff the treatment facilities. So right now, the administration has taken this very careful, well thought out way to look at this. First thing first is infrastructure. And so they're sending CVs over to people that build construction battalion people, and they're sending people and that do epidemiology and tracking and create rings and do contacts, teaching people how to do that. And then they're trying to recruit doctors and nurses from all over the world to actually come and man the units and eventually train people in those countries to be there. But once they come back in, it's like anything else, and we have a lot of experience with this because the United States military sends people everywhere, so does USAID. So they'll come back and they'll be in a quarantine period for 21 days, and if they don't get sick, their temperature will be taken. We know how it starts. We know what the original signs and symptoms are. Bleeding is at the end, but we know what the original signs and symptoms are. If they don't get sick, then I think we'll be okay.
We're just going around the room.
So I definitely, earlier I was talking about the United States and what we have to worry about. I didn't mean to say that we need to worry about it by ourselves. I completely agree that it is a world issue. There's no borders when it comes to disease. That's a collective world issue. And, you know, like you said, it's dangerous, and we do have a moral responsibility to go and help deal with it. I think that we have the resources, and there's no reason why we shouldn't. I'm glad that we're over there. I think we're doing the right thing. But earlier, what you were talking about with the back in the 80s, the infected animals in Spain, they're concerned about the dog population, the wild dog population. They found a couple with Ebola. Yeah, and now I read about this article not half an hour ago, right before I came here. I saw this. They're executing packs of wild dogs in Spain. I just wanted to bring that point up as well.
So that's a concern I have, not about the removal of dogs as much as the viruses that jump between different animal vectors, whether it's a chicken to a human to a swine, or a primate to a human. The likelihood that they can evolve in ways that might be unpredictable. I don't know if Ebola has shown signs of rapidly evolving like
Well,
HIV.
it's sort of, it hasn't, I haven't seen a lot of weird, at least reports of weird mutations
Yeah.
since they've been following this since 1976. I mean, it apparently is carried by bats. And then bats eat fruit and they drop it, and then primates and wolves and other things will get sick. The bats never get sick. They're vectors. They're flying around happy with the virus and not getting sick, which is why they're good vectors. But there are, and then we're getting it from, I mean, there was a big thing about bushmeat, but it's not just bushmeat. It's a lot of, there's animal carcasses that are used for a variety of purposes by lots of people, and in the United States and everywhere else. And so touching these animals was maybe some original cases, but a lot of the cases now is just trying to help family members and not having
Right.
gloves and things.
Did you hear the story this morning on NPR about the nurses? They were actually handling some sick infants, unprotected, and there was one facility that lost more than 20 nurses died from handling the infants
From ignorance.
because they couldn't resist trying to comfort
Oh,
these
no, it's
babies.
family members, and some of them don't have enough gloves. I mean, I've been in countries where there were no needles and gloves, where we brought in, we thought we were being nice, we were bringing in a lot of supplies, but those supplies were gone within no time at all.
Natalie, we'll have to wrap it up, so go ahead.
So I thought Jeff was going to take your point about the dogs in Spain being, summarily executed in a different direction. Where I was taking it is that a fear that I have is I heard a report about, I don't know out of which airport people would be stopped, and they would be not fielded but screened to see if they were carriers in any way. And my mind, maybe it's the conspiracy theorist, but my mind went to what if this turned into something where that became a rationale for randomly cordoning off undesirables or people who because you know you could be
That's a good point.
so take that dog metaphor to the human level
Yeah.
of okay, we suspect that your kind could be carriers of this disease. We'll screen you here at this airport, even though we don't have, you might be in the incubation phase, we don't have exact evidence. You have to sit over here. And I just had this was just yesterday. I was sitting in my car listening to
Really good.
NPR. I thought you could have families separated. You could have parents with their children. And
It's a good thing, our history, we've never done that. Oh, wait a minute.
Right.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. We really have to end at this point. I want to thank everyone for coming here to discuss something, sharing the information, hopefully quelling some of the fear, but there is something to be feared of. And perhaps we can keep on target in helping, as Dylan said, the world as opposed to being fearful and staying out. Because as Dean Baker said, it's a global situation, not a local one. And if we don't face up to it properly, it may come here despite all our efforts. Thank you, everyone.
thank you.
Thanks.
It's 5.